Hi there, everyone. It is 1 minute after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with Edgar Zaswata, ACSA Senior Director of Policy and Governmental Relations. I'm Naj and Edgar, ACSA Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. We are so happy to have you here on the show today. Go ahead, jump into our chat, say hello, let us know where you're watching from today. Edgar, this was the first time that I'm getting to see you since our meeting last Wednesday. How are you? How's everything going?
And I was trying to remember that as we're starting. I was about to say it's been a week since I saw you, but I wasn't completely sure. It's kind of become a blur here. Either way, it's always good to be back. You know, there's no place I would rather be Wednesdays at 1 o'clock.
Wednesdays at 1. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And you know what? I do want to give a shout out to Joseph Williams, who's been an active viewer over the last couple of weeks. Joseph was already saying hello to us, was already in standby mode. He was the first one in standby mode as we were getting ready to come on the air today. So, Joseph, so good to have you back today, along with Gary. Charlie Hoffman is here, Linda Jordan, Mary Lim. So good to have you guys here with us today. We got a big show for you today, a lot of news to cover. And then Austin Beutner, the superintendent from the Los Angeles Unified School District, is going to be here today. We're going to hit him up on a number of topics. Some statistics that have come out from LA Unified, obviously his retirement, and then Edgar wants to hit him up on Dodger questions. And I'm not all that fired up about Dodger questions, but we'll see if we can't get this show to go as long as possible up to that 1:30 time frame, and then go, oh, sorry, we couldn't ask any of those Dodger questions.
It hasn't been a great week for my Dodgers, so maybe I should be smarter to just be quiet and let it go, because I know I'm going to get some razzing there from San Diego and San Francisco and other parts of our beautiful state here.
Yeah, and I'm actually seeing, pardon me, folks, I'm actually seeing some Giants fans that I know over there on the chat. So just be prepared for that. Oh, Gary Reller must be a St. Louis Cardinals fan, because I just saw him drop that into the chat. Hey, before we get to Austin, let me bring up a couple of things, couple of topics for you, Edgar, because it would be good for us to get some updates. First, let's talk about the news on masks and the impact on schools. What is the potential impact on schools with the masks, and just what the new guidelines are?
Yeah, it's a great question. I know there's a lot. It made a lot of headlines yesterday. First, the CDC saying that they're updating their recommendations that fully vaccinated people can now go outside and participate in activities outside as long as they're around other vaccinated people without face coverings. There's a lot of caveats in the recommendation, as folks probably know, that in large groups, like our favorite example, if I were to go to a Dodger game, regardless of if I'm vaccinated or not, I should be wearing a face covering. So there's a lot of questions. The state has indicated, remember, CDC just gives the recommendation. The state has its own mask mandate. The governor did go ahead and say yesterday that the intent is to align the state guidance to the CDC recommendations as it relates to schools. There hasn't been any specific talk about this. This is our expectation because they've already communicated this a number of times. I believe it was last week we were talking about the health forecast for the following year. The administration has told us over and over that they fully expect that the mask mandate is going to be around for the foreseeable future. So I think it'd be a surprise if they adjust that for schools, and I think for one important reason, and I think that's going to become a theme of all the changes we'll see in the coming months, is that as we vaccinate more Californians, the one population that's going to remain unvaccinated, at least for the time being, are individuals under 16 years of age, right? So it's our school-age population. So I do believe even as some of the rules are loosened, we could expect that some of those requirements as it relates to students, to kids, are still going to be there. So that still more to come. Obviously, it'll be important in terms of what exactly gets changed. But for the time being, it's a status quo. We still have a mask requirement, especially in schools.
And before we get to our guest, Edgar, I want to ask you this question because I know I know our guest is going to be interested in this. Update from the state capitol, from the legislature, on what schools may look like next year, because obviously now we've got the end of this school year, we've got the summer months, and then we flow into next year. What are we hearing out of the state capitol?
It's probably the most important question we're getting here on a daily basis. I have to imagine in a couple of weeks, I'm sure we're going to have shows completely dedicated to what the state is now saying in terms of what are the parameters are going to be in terms of the next year. Here's kind of what we know right now. I think everybody, and you'll remember our Ledge Action Day a few weeks ago, every policymaker from the governor, legislative leadership, everybody's in lockstep saying that they believe that in-person instruction will be the default mode of instruction. The bigger question, the more complicated question, is what's going to be the role of distance learning? To what extent is it going to have some parameters? We don't have answers yet. I will say there is a growing contingent of legislators who have vocalized their desire to say that there should be strict parameters on distance learning, that essentially only students with medical exemptions should be offered distance learning. That's not necessarily the prevailing perspective, so I don't want people to misinterpret this, that this is what's going to happen. But I think we need to be aware of that, because I know just from seeing the chat week to week, from hearing from our members, hearing from our folks on a week in, week out basis, I think the general perspective amongst the field is that distance learning definitely has a role, especially next year. We're not out of the pandemic. As we talked about, students are not vaccinated yet. And I think most of our educators feel that it shouldn't be as limited as some of the legislators are talking about. All this to say, it's probably another opportunity for some advocacy from our folks. If they feel strongly on this issue, probably worth checking in with their members and with their respective policymakers and talking about their specific story. But more to come definitely in the next couple of weeks on what the governor's going to propose on this front and where the legislature may land here.
Yeah, a lot of work to do. Let's go ahead and bring in our guest. We are honored today to have the superintendent from the Los Angeles Unified School District with us. Austin Beutner joins us today. Austin, of course, made some headlines. He is getting set to retire, so we'll give him a hard time about what his summer plans are near the end of the show. Austin, so good to have you with us here on the show, your return visit. I want to hit up on a statistic that came from EdSource this week about students coming back into the schools. You guys had an expectation for a number. It turned out to be a smaller number than initially, but now the numbers have gotten up to 85% of the students that you expected to be back are now back, with more expected on the way. Successes and challenges then for you, sir, about how things have gone in reopening schools, and were those challenges some of the ones that you and your team expected?
Thanks. And first, Naj and Edgar, thanks for having me. And I appreciate everybody taking time out of what we know are busy days to be part of this conversation. It's kind of interesting here. We're back at the beginning in certain respects, which is the path to reopening is all about safety. We'll come and we'll talk, I'm sure, in this conversation about what instruction looks like, what we're doing, what the student experience is. But a year plus, we were all faced with this disease none of us knew much about, how to keep our school community safe. And that is the centerpiece of our conversation about reopening schools. It's about the air filtration system upgrades. It's about the social distancing practices, the masks, the personal protective equipment, the cohorting of students, the doubling of custodial staff, all of the mitigation measures we put in place. And we've gone a step further. We have COVID tested every student staff member who are back for in-person work at a school, whether they're a student or staff member, and we'll continue to do that on a weekly basis, on an ongoing basis. So a year ago and today, we're still dealing with that same foundation, which is you can't get on with the instruction until people are safe. So that's been a Herculean effort by all of my colleagues in schools. So many administrative leaders have worked tirelessly. I know we'll talk a little about fatigue, but the front lines, the back lines, and all lines for us have worked round the clock. But we're starting with the safest set of protocols we can do. And I think, like many on this call, we serve communities that have been devastated by COVID. Not just the job loss, not just the anxiety and the trauma, but real loss of life. I was at an elementary school the other day with about 500 students, 10 lost lives between parents and grandparents of students and staff. The healing and recovery for that community is going to take a while. So we didn't expect all students to come back right away. Even in elementary, we offer a full day program 5 days a week. District-wide, we're expecting about 40%. We see the first week is roughly half or 2/3, and it's 3/4, 80% by the second week once families see it's okay. But we're still under half of elementary students returning, and because of limitations and other issues. It's different for secondary schools, but I'd say the challenge was and is the same, which is to do this in a way which is safe and stands the test of time, not only open schools, but keeps them open safely for students and staff.
Austin, thanks for joining us again. And like you said, I know busy days for you and your team. I believe the state superintendent was in your guys' neck of the woods today and making the rounds there. So just appreciate taking some minutes. Kind of on the follow-up, and you alluded to it. I'm just wondering, from a student perspective, generally, how's it going? What are you hearing from the students? I know I see you on social media and numerous outlets. You're in classrooms almost every day. Kind of what's the feedback you're getting from the students and from families?
Students, staff, and families, A's all around. Students are thrilled to be back. Apprehensive, almost the older a student is, the more they have a little bit of concern because they're just more aware. Kindergartners don't know life was different before. Ninth graders that I was welcoming today, 10th graders, they understand life was a little different. So anxieties, but delighted to be back. Same with our staff, same with the families that we are serving. And each step of this process, we're trying to make them feel welcome, have them spread the word to their friends. Yesterday, we broke big news for us. We are reopening all of our elementary school playgrounds. As you can imagine, that's an audience that was delighted to hear that. So each day, a little bit of progress, and we're just really, really careful to make sure we build on the progress we're having. There's no race, as all of us know, to the swiftest here. This race will be won by all of us who do it the right way, because that's going to endure.
Austin, another question for me. I know it since the beginning of the pandemic. I think it's fair to say that you've never been shy about telling the state or state leaders, what you believe the system needs and, what kind of support our schools need. So now as we look into next year, and obviously you, as Naj mentioned, you announced that you won't be returning next year, but I know that you still have very much a stake on how this progresses in terms of the educational system. So I guess I'd ask you, what do you believe the state needs to provide in terms of support for districts and for schools now? And kind of the big question of the day, what's your opinion on the role of distance learning as we go into the next academic year?
A couple fold. I think we all, and part of the reason I felt comfortable with the transition is in a certain sense, we've done the hardest part, right? Reopening schools in the safest way possible and putting in a series of plans, be happy to talk about, to help with student learning recovery and the path from there. We're looking at next year and the year after with record levels of funding at the state and local level. And thanks to all my colleagues on this call, the collective advocacy is working. So for the first time in a decade, we're not going to be trying to do this with an arm tied behind our back or suffering from the lack of adequacy. So the challenge, I think, is how do we then put the dollars into schools to greatest effect? My advice for the policymakers is they got to move quicker. They got to be where we are. We know what the challenges are in schools. You raised the topic of what does the fall look like. We're all planning for what the fall looks like. We started months ago, and I'm sure my colleagues on this call did too. And one of the challenges we had in COVID was some of the guidance from the state was either a little late or a little incomplete or both. And that doesn't serve us well in schools. We need to be looking to the horizon. So my advice to the state on issues having to do with what the fall looks like, having to do with when online. I think online is here to stay and should be here to stay. For some students, we're finding they actually prefer that mode. They still want to be on the football team, but they'd like to spend a portion of their day. We've seen so many of the tools and technologies that teachers and students have learned to use be a complement to what happens in a school classroom. So the fall for us will be full day, all day in person, of course, as the core of what we do. But the notion that we should give up this one-to-one connection we now have with families, we're using it not just for instruction, we're using it for health supports and COVID testing and vaccinations, the ability to have students participate in other forms of learning enrichment. We're doing some district-wide enrichment classes with all kinds of interesting people and teachers. Those opportunities we shouldn't close the door on just because COVID hopefully will become a memory at some point in the future. So I think 1 and 1 has got to be 3, not 2. And I don't look forward to a new year or the year after if we take a step back from the richness that these tools and technologies can bring us, built on the core of in-person instruction.
Austin, you mentioned right at the top of our broadcast about educator burnout, just the impact that COVID has had on education leaders. From your perspective, and then maybe some of the feedback you've had from other school leaders in other parts of the state and parts of the country, what is the solution? What is the impact of COVID first on school leaders? And then what do you think as far as solutions are concerned?
You know, I can't see hands, but I'm sure if we had a show of hands, it's been 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. Just, you know, worse than the whack-a-mole, just when you think you have dealt with whatever the COVID cards are that day or that week, they change. So I think all of us and everyone in a school district, we've had bus drivers working out of class, helping distribute devices. We've had teachers learning technology at night and using it to teach during the day. We've had custodians working overtime to clean and sanitize. So I think all of the school community are facing that. Now, juxtapose that with the students and families we serve who may be facing it to an even greater extent because of job loss or illness or the trauma and anxiety that families are dealing with. So what I'm particularly proud of in Los Angeles Unified is we have stood up when we had to stand up with the meals we provided, more than any other organization in the nation, 123 million meals, the devices, the COVID testing. Now we're doing vaccinations, for, not just for staff and students, but families at schools. We've opened 25 school-based vaccination centers. So maybe the silver lining is in all of this, the communities we serve and the broader community better understands just how central role public education plays. But the next chapter has to be all of them getting in the game and helping us. You know, we could have just a lunch to talk about the digital divide, which we all suffer from, and so many of the families we serve suffer from. We see the symptom in schools, but for goodness sakes, communication policy and funding have been the province of the FCC or the state PUC forever. I can't tell you, there's not a school I go to where a family doesn't say, gosh, we can't afford internet, have crappy internet in our neighborhood. What can you do to help? We're here to help. But if we have the next chapter of this where people just forget about schools and say, you know, too bad some of your families can't connect, shame on all of us, because we need state help, federal help, and the policy push at those levels have to get us to a better place. Just an example, one of the tools that we all use in schools, we don't solve the issue of the digital divide in the state of California. Schools were informed, we see it on the front lines, but we don't have the answers. We shouldn't be the policy arm of government that tries to fix that.
Austin, we got a question from one of our viewers, Holly Eats, who actually was going to ask a similar question to what I was going to pose. So great minds think alike there. You obviously brought a unique perspective to the superintendency since day one. And obviously there's been a lot of challenges in the last year, but as you alluded to in one of your earlier answers, there's a lot of lessons learned from the pandemic. So as Holly asked, what are some of the most innovative things you've seen within, you know, your district, obviously the vast school network that you have, and what are some things that we need to hang on to post?
Yeah, sure. I'll use one. They're both core, but one's maybe a little more fun and one's a little more spinach. We created a guitar class with Fender. 5,000 students are now participating, middle schoolers. The premise is simple. We needed more music in schools and middle schools, that awkward age where children don't know their own identity, and music can help them find their voice. Pandemic came, rather than put it on the back burner, we said, let's send the students guitars. Our teachers were excited to teach in that with Zooms and online and everything else that go with it. Now we've got 5,000 students enrolled. Different. We wouldn't have thought we could, but we are, and we're going to continue to grow it. And with the support of partners like Fender, we're able to do some amazing things. Sort of more in the core, we started back in August, something we call Primary Promise. I'm sure, like, again, all my colleagues on this call, we saw in our first graders probably about a 10-point drop in reading proficiency. Now, these would have been first graders this year, kindergartners last year. About the worst thing that could happen in the last 3-4 months of your kindergarten year is to not be in a classroom. Just as you're learning to read, you're learning to sound out vowels and everything else that comes with it. So we decided to act last August. The first thing we did using some of the tools and technologies were real quickie diagnostics, 10-minute exercise, not a big state summative exercise. We added, sort of in an old school fashion, more reading teachers into the classroom. And these were digital classrooms to enable them to work with small groups of students, one-on-one, one-on-two, one-on-three. And we're seeing amazing things. We took 2,500 students who were not readers. So 2,500 of our highest need students who have caught up in just half a year with the rest of their first grade peers. So we took 2,500 students, we expanded it to 6,700 students second semester, and we will expand it to about 15,000 students in first semester, meaning the start of the new school year. It's old school and new school because fundamentally you're putting a reading specialist, pushing her or him into a classroom to work one-on-one or with a small group of students. But the diagnostic tools, the ability to create truly an individualized program or set of instruction outline for that individual, the ability to convene the gen ed teacher, the reading specialist, the school principal, the coordinator in real time each week to look at the progress. I don't think we could have done that before. I don't think we would have had the same sense of urgency. And the tools and technologies help support what that reading teacher is doing on the front lines with the student.
Austin, I have two questions that have come in from viewers, and they really do talk about, that next step after this school year is done, what's coming up after that. Joseph Williams asked, can you tell us about LAUSD's Black Student Achievement Plan? And then Muhammad Warad over in Elk Grove Unified School Districts asks, what will summer school look like in LA Unified, credit recovery, enrichment, both? So two questions for you as we look towards the summer and the next school year.
Sure. Black student, I'll just take them in the order. What we are doing is trying to break the cycle of despair, the cycle of lack of opportunity for our Black or African American students. And it starts with a commitment to two things. Just a quantum change in funding. The average school, and we're targeting 16 schools with our highest portions of African American students, somewhere in the 25 to 35% increase in funding. So just a sea change and a different approach, because if you just take your norms, and again, however school districts norm class size or funding and change it 3%, you might get a 3% change, but you're not going to get a 50% change. So we're looking at how we, starting with leadership, starting with what happens in the classroom, how do we totally change the model to make sure each student is getting that unique support. So we put in the resources to do it. We have a very, much like Primary Promise, we have a very specific set of actions we'll be taking so that each student has a plan. And each student's plan is supported by more direct instruction, more mental health support, and all of the other things that we'd like to see in schools. So I think this is our stake in the ground to say we're not going to perpetuate what has happened for decades, plural now. Starts with funding and a commitment to do things differently. We have new leadership taking a fresh set of eyes, so I'm excited about where we are in that. As far as the summer for us, we offered summer for all last summer. We will offer summer for all again this summer. We'll have constraints as to participation levels, both by whether families are willing and also whether all of our workforce, going back to people being tired, what portion of students and staff we can actually have back on campus. We will base it on in-person. So the core of it will be in-person, although we will continue to offer more community-based online. So think of the school as an in-person program. What we've done in Los Angeles Unified over the last couple of years is push all of our central teams to local communities. So we're organized around 44 what we call communities of schools. So each community of school will make sure to have online offerings. It might not be every elementary school, depending upon participation levels, whereas every elementary school will have in-person instruction, both core literacy and math as well as enrichment. And we're kind of designing the day around morning literacy, math, afternoon enrichment. That also allows our online students to participate in either portion of the day.
Austin, I think it was one of your predecessors, Governor Roy Romer, who said that his job as LA Unified Superintendent was actually harder than being the governor of Colorado. So now as you finish up your tenure here, curious, just your takeaways, what you'll take away from your time in the district. Was the job as hard as you thought it would be? Obviously, you were dealing with the pandemic. And then maybe what are you going to be most proud of over your time there at LA Unified?
Sure. Yeah, it's hard, but it's also the most rewarding job I've ever had. And I think Roy would say the same thing. It was hard before COVID. And since COVID, we have become not just a school, but a relief organization providing food and other supplies. We've become a health organization providing COVID testing and vaccinations. We've been a media organization trying to explain to families how to use tools and technology. So we're now the technology provider for a community, the health provider for a community, the food and relief effort, as well as providing instruction support for children. So I think we've all seen when we can step up to fill a void, but that void can't be filled by schools forever. And it is a hard job, but it's the most rewarding job I've ever held. Looking forward, I came in the middle of a conversation about the Dodgers. Our relief pitching has been struggling. I've been talking to Dave Roberts, so maybe he needs a little bit of interim help. I can spend part of my summer just making sure the Dodgers are repeat champions. For anyone on this call, I would say champions who will repeat. Let's just emphasize that we're champions.
There we go. How's the rotator cuff? You're good enough to go step in and get some relief pitching in?
Watching against the Padres the other night, I think any of us on this call might have done a little bit better. But all kidding aside, we're excited for the Dodgers this year, and my family and I are big baseball fans.
I'm still, for the record, it makes tough. Like we've had a tough week, but it makes it a lot easier having that that World Series behind us. So I'm still riding the honeymoon, at least for a little bit, right?
Yeah. Well, I had the good fortune as we reopened athletic facilities for students and competitions in accordance with the state CIF. I threw out the first pitch in our first baseball game and strike over the corner of the plate. I was kidding with the reporter. I said it was 93. I think it was more like 39. But the actual pitcher hit 94 on the same gun. So we have some great athletes back at schools, and maybe one of them will be a Dodger someday.
Okay. So before we close out with you, let me ask you. So for clarification, that first pitch that you made there, that was at one of your school's campuses? Okay. All right.
Yep.
So
Hamilton High playing Banning. And as I said, it was just over the outside corner, nice little slider. It was probably sliding over the plate by the time I got there. Banning has a big lefty.
One of the famous, flops in terms of we've seen so many celebrities or officials try to go up there and throw first pitch and it goes into the dugout or whatnot. So
I was planning for it. I did warm up with someone, and fortunately, I didn't embarrass anyone in my family.
Which was more nerve-wracking, you doing that or having to possibly go over to Dodger Stadium and do it there?
Well, I was in Dodger Stadium. We did a virtual graduation online for all of our students for the school district, and Dave Roberts joined me. So I've already been on the pitcher's mound in Dodger Stadium, and we did a funny little bit because part of it I threw a baseball on my way out to give my remarks, and when Dave Roberts came out, he took the baseball from my hand, much as he might happen to a relief pitcher. So I've been on the mound. Fortunately, I didn't have to throw for the Dodgers, but it's been a remarkable year, and if nothing else has happened, I hope in Los Angeles we have rebuilt trust with the educators in our schools because we've taken care of them, we've kept them safe, we've helped them understand how much we understand they're important. And I think we've rebuilt trust with the communities we serve by keeping their children safe, keeping the families safe, keeping them connected, and doing our best, even though we knew the best was back in the classroom, which we're just now getting to.
Austin Beutner, Superintendent, Los Angeles Unified School District. Something tells me, Austin, that you being a student advocate, your retirement will not just be spent on the beach. So don't lose our number. We'll contact you and talk to you a little bit later on.
Great. Look forward to it. Thank you. Appreciate the work you do.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. That was LA Unified Superintendent Austin Beutner. Hey, Edgar, before we go, I did see a question, and we may need to do some research on this, but I did see a question that came in from ACSA Vice President Charlie Hoffman, President-elect Charlie Hoffman. I meant make sure I get the title correct. I know. I knew I was going to screw that up. Charlie asks, any word on state measures for us to be reimbursed to feed all students, regardless of the FRLP status? Do we have anything on that, or is that something we want to dig into?
Yeah, well, no, there was some flexibility given on the federal end in terms of continuing some of the measures they had this year. I think the question that comes up is that there's a lot of ramifications for that. And I know we've heard some concerns also about if you're going to get the flexibility from the federal end, it does take away some of the incentive to collect these lunch forms. And I know that's a struggle that many of our communities are dealing with, because now, at least in this state, it's not just about feeding kids, which is obviously the primary focus there, is the nutrition, and it also has impacts on our funding in terms of our LCFF rates and whatnot. So I know that is a point of discussion, something that ACSA is very focused on. And I think that will be part of the broader conversations here as we go into May Revise.
Yeah, I May Revise is something we're gonna hit in a couple of weeks. Obviously, what schools are gonna look like next year, how the mask mandate impacts everything. We'll talk about those over the next couple of weeks. Still plenty to come. Edgar, so good to see you. So good to have the superintendent on, and you and I, maybe we'll actually have a meeting face to face before the next show comes.
Hey, last time I tried to be in the same room as you, I had all kinds of problems. Maybe I'm just going to go back to it's not going to happen now. We'll see. I'll have to consider it. So
I should have had a camera that was running through the hallways here so we could record you sprinting from one side of the office to the other.
We'll get it right. We'll get it right.
Edgar, good to see you, man.
All right, till next time, Naj.
All right, folks, thank you so much for being with us today on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We're back here next Wednesday, 1 p.m., live and interactive. Have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week.